The first debate is over. The election is only weeks away. In this US politics special edition of UpFront, I'll ask left-wing Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein whether she should stand aside to stop right-wing Donald Trump. We'll also examine Hillary Clinton's record on regime change and debate the impact of Black Lives Matter. Jill Stein, thanks for joining me on UpFront. What are you offering the American public that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton aren't offering them? What sets you apart from them as a presidential candidate?
I'm the only candidate in this race who is not taking money from lobbyists, from big corporate interests, and I do not have a super PAC. So I am the one candidate that actually has the liberty to stand up for what the American people desperately need and are demanding. And that includes an emergency jobs program to put America back to work, and a jobs program, in fact, that will also fix the emergency of climate change. I'm the only candidate talking about the crisis with our young people, a generation that's locked in debt, essentially without a future, and also calling for an end to police violence, a welcoming path to citizenship, and a foreign policy based on international law and human rights, not more of this catastrophic, failed regime change policies, these endless wars for oil and against terror, which are in fact only creating more terror. So I am the one candidate that can actually tell it like it is and provide the real solutions that the American people need.
And a lot of people at home would have been nodding along to a lot of what you just said. But isn't the fundamental problem for you, of course, that you have zero chance of implementing any of that, of winning the presidency? I think you're currently polling at around 3 or 4%. So why are you running? What's the point?
You know, you could talk to a young person and say, what is the point? You know, you have no future, you have no job, you are mired in debt. Why are you even bothering? You know, there are a whole lot of people out here that are sick and tired of a rigged economy and a rigged political system. And you know what? The amazing thing is if you actually put us all together, we have more than the votes that it takes to win this. Just the number of people trapped in student debt alone is more than a plurality of the vote in a three-way race. So the critical question is, can the American people get a right to actually know who they can vote for? Americans are supposed to have a right to vote. We also have a right to know who we can vote for.
Of course.
Very few people know about our campaign.
I don't think anyone would dispute.
We have been the most silenced and blacked out.
I don't think anyone would dispute your right to run or your ability to give people a voice or a right for people to vote for you. But the reality is you're not going to be president come November. The next president is going to be either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. So what I want to ask you is, who would you rather see in the White House out of those two people? Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton?
Well, you know, what the American people would rather see is neither of them, because they are rejecting those two candidates who are being shoved down their throats by the corporate media.
Completely agree with you.
And these
but
are
the
the
two
most
candidates who are going to be president. You're not seriously saying to us that you are going to be the next president of the United States. It is going to be Hillary or Donald Trump. And I'm just wondering, again, who out of those two is the lesser of the two evils? Even if you don't like either of them, who's the lesser of the two evils?
It's not a matter of not liking them. It's a matter of that in this election, we're not just deciding what kind of a future we will have, but whether we will have a future at all or not.
I want you to listen to Noam Chomsky. Well, hold on. I want you to listen to Noam Chomsky, who I interviewed earlier this year, who's a supporter of yours. This is what he said when I asked him whether he'd vote in a swing state for Hillary Clinton as the lesser of two evils.
I didn't like Obama, but I said exactly the same thing. There's a constant...
Hillary has your vote if you were in a swing state.
Well, let's put it that way.
Yes.
My vote would be against the Republican candidate.
Do you agree, Jill Stein, with Noam Chomsky, that if you're in a swing state, a state like Pennsylvania where you are now, that could determine the next election result, you should vote for Hillary as a progressive in order to stop the lesser of two evils, the very right-wing, some would say far right-wing candidate, Donald Trump? Surely that's a no-brainer.
It will be horrific if Donald Trump gets elected, but I am not at all reassured by the policies of Hillary Clinton, who led us into the catastrophe of Libya, who approved of the war in Iraq. And you put her in charge, she will start an air war with Russia over Syria. She's already told us that she wants to create a no-fly zone. Democracy is not who do we hate the most and who are we most afraid of. Democracy needs an affirmative agenda. It needs a moral compass.
It also needs a realistic agenda, Jill Stein.
For how we go forward.
And as much as many people would agree with
In my view, it is not realistic.
It is not realistic to say to a voter in a swing state.
Are not realistic. One will support coal.
Okay, but one
of them
is going to be the next president. Most Americans are going to choose between those two people. And if they were to ask you, Jill Stein, I want you to be president, but I'm in a swing state. I'm worried about Donald Trump, like Noam Chomsky is. Should I vote for Hillary Clinton to stop Trump? What is your advice to that voter?
He should vote for our future with an independent political party that will actually serve us.
So he should not vote Hillary to stop Trump?
In the long run.
So he should not vote Hillary to stop Trump?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Don't fall for that trap.
So even if that lets Trump in, you're fine with that?
That is a fast trip over the cliff.
And even if that results in a Donald Trump presidency, you are fine with that?
I will feel terrible if Donald Trump gets elected, and I will feel terrible if Hillary Clinton gets elected. I am not fooled by the illusion that the greater or the lesser evil is going to get us out of this mess.
Would you feel terrible if Donald Trump gets elected because people voted for you rather than Hillary, and that's the reason he gets elected?
I will feel terrible if we do not fight with every ounce of our bodies and every ounce of our spirit to establish the democracy, which is essential if we are going to get out of here alive. If we are ever going to prevail, we have to build. So I would say vote for your future. Vote to build our power, because the greater and the lesser evil, this is the politics of fear. Reject the politics of fear. Fight for the greater good.
When Bernie Sanders, who's also railed against the predatory system and the outsourcing of jobs, and you invited him in July to lead your party's presidential ticket, when he says now that actually now is not the time for a protest vote, now is the time to get behind people who want to stop Donald Trump, i.e. Hillary Clinton, and he says, if you guys want to go and run for Congress or run for governorship, fine, now is the time to stop Donald Trump from being president, this guy who is promising to ban Muslims from America, deport 11 million quote-unquote illegal immigrants, kill the families of terror suspects, bring back waterboarding or worse, incites violence against all sorts of protesters. When he says you're just a protest vote, it's time to stop Donald Trump. Is he wrong as well?
As he said himself, he is a man, he is not the movement. This is a time for a movement, and that movement is not drinking the Kool-Aid. Some are, but many are not going into Hillary's camp. Do you know that 40% of Americans are not going to vote in this election because they do not buy what the Democrats and Republicans are offering to us? Hillary Clinton is not different enough from Donald Trump that she or the Democratic Party are going to save your job, save your life, or save the planet. So we have two ways to commit suicide here, and I say no thank you to them both. I would rather go down fighting than to allow myself to commit suicide by voting for either political party which has been driving us over the cliff.
When Donald Trump says, as he did in July, I think a vote for Stein would be good because I figure anyone voting for Stein is going to be for Hillary. So I think a vote for Stein is fine. Does that make you uncomfortable at all that he's so keen on your candidacy for obviously selfish reasons?
Well, Donald Trump is, he may be a good publicist, but he is not he doesn't have the last word on political or strategic analysis. Would you say the same thing? Would you tell Gary Johnson to also get out of the race because he happens to be drawing more votes from Hillary Clinton?
Yes, many people would say that in order to stop Trump,
in other words,
candidates should get out of the way.
What you are saying is that what you're saying is that we should only have two official political parties in this country, and let's just be like
I'm saying that is the reality. The next president will be Trump or
and
Clinton,
suppress political
and you seem to be fine with both.
I don't think that is how we're going to get out of this.
Okay, just turning to foreign policy, you have an admirable record of opposing militarism, illegal wars, standing up for the Palestinians under occupation. You've been praised for that by many on the left. But on Russia, your critics think you're too soft on Vladimir Putin. Late last year, for example, you went to a Russian government-sponsored conference in Moscow where you filmed a video outside the Kremlin in which you explicitly called for the, quote, reining in of US exceptionalism and denounced a US policy of domination, which many people would agree with you on. But you didn't say anything in that video about the illegal Russian annexation of Crimea or alleged Russian war crimes in Syria. Why is that? Is it because you don't think Russia's done anything wrong in Syria or Ukraine?
Well, you know, that video was about approximately a 20-second clip, so there wasn't much. That was an
it was 2
informal
minutes, 20
hello
seconds.
to our supporters from Russia. Well, it was still an informal hello to our supporters. That was not a message. I gave Vladimir Putin a message at that conference, and that message was that he needed to stop bombing Syria in the same way that I gave that message to President Obama. But Vladimir Putin was actually listening. So I went there to criticize Vladimir Putin for his extremely ineffective war policy, which I would put together with that of the U.S. In fact, the U.S. is collaborating with Russia now in this bombing campaign.
Indeed it is.
You know, it's great that they're collaborating, but they should be collaborating on a weapons embargo and on an embargo against the funding of terrorist enterprises.
You say you
so
went,
yes, I'm all
you
for
say you went to
collaboration, but I am
criticize him.
not for war.
Okay, no one is saying you're for
Yes.
war. You're saying you went to criticize him, but a lot of people saw a picture of you sitting around a table with Putin himself at a dinner hosted by the state-owned TV channel where you didn't say anything about human rights or democracy, and two prominent Russian environmentalists wrote you an
as a
open
matter of fact,
they wrote you an open
what
letter on Facebook saying, by silencing Putin's crimes, you are silencing our struggle. By shaking his hand and failing to criticize his regime, you are becoming his accomplice.
Well, in fact, we have criticized his regime. We have criticized his oppression of environmental justice and gay rights groups and so on. You know, sitting around that table, there was no translator, so there was not an opportunity
he speaks English.
to actually
He
talk.
understands English.
But
you could have said something to him. Wouldn't you have said something to Obama? Wouldn't you have said something to Obama at a table? Would you have shared a table with Obama silently?
There was no opportunity. Well, put it this way, I would not have an opportunity to even sit at the table with Obama. I went there to a conference to send a message to Russia that they needed to get with the program and abandon the politics of weapons and bombing as an answer to this terrorism crisis, which is affecting them every bit as much as the U.S.
And one last question. You ran for president for the Greens in 2012. You got less than 1% of the vote. You're running again this year. You're on course for 3, 4, 5% of the vote. Do you think you'll do this all again in 2020? Run again a third time for the Greens for president?
Put it this way, I have no illusions that the Democratic or Republican parties are going to fix this. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We, the public interest, we who are not controlled by the corporate money, the lobbyists, and by the super PACs. It falls to us to build a political movement. There is a social movement right now around the world that is fighting against climate change, that is fighting for human rights and for workers' rights. We are not represented by the major political parties in the countries around the world. So in the United States, we are building an independent political force, and we're doing it from the ground up. Fortunately, the American people now are realizing this and have divorced the Democratic and Republican parties. The major block of voters now is outside of those parties. They can only survive as long as they suppress our voices. But we are not going away. We are getting louder and we are getting stronger.
Jill Stein, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Great to be with you.
We all know how keen hawkish Hillary Clinton is on regime change in the Middle East, in Iraq, Libya, Syria. What often gets forgotten, however, is what she did in Honduras. The fact that Honduras was a democracy didn't stop then Secretary of State Clinton backing regime change even there. Back in 2009, she threw her support behind the coup that ousted democratically elected Honduran President Manuel Zelaya, who was flown out of the country in his pajamas. While the UN, the EU, and the OAS were calling for Zelaya to be immediately reinstated, Clinton was, in her own words, to quote her 2014 memoir Hard Choices, strategizing a plan to restore order in Honduras and ensure that free and fair elections could be held quickly and legitimately, which would render the question of Zelaya moot. A pretty damning admission. Which is probably why she removed it from the paperback edition of her memoir that came out a year later. To make things worse, to this day, Clinton insists, against all evidence, that Honduran institutions followed the law in removing President Zelaya and refuses to call a coup a coup.
Our assessment was we should slow walk and try to stop anything that the government could take advantage of without calling it a coup.
That wasn't the assessment of our own US ambassador on the ground in Honduras at the time, who wrote in an official memo, "There is no doubt that the military, Supreme Court, and National Congress conspired on June 28th in what constituted an illegal and unconstitutional coup." That memo of his includes the word coup a mere 12 times. Maybe Clinton just lost it in all her other emails. But here's the worst part. Earlier this year, Clinton actually congratulated herself on how events in Honduras turned out.
We managed a very difficult situation without bloodshed.
Put aside for a moment that the people of Honduras might not want the US managing situations in their country, to say with a straight face that the whole thing happened without bloodshed is astonishing, given the UN says the murder rate in Honduras went up by almost 50% after the coup, with the return of death squads, ongoing violence, and soldiers accused of murder and torture. Berta Cáceres, the famous Honduran human rights activist who singled out Hillary Clinton for backing the Honduran coup, warned in 2013 that the army has an assassination list of 18 wanted human rights fighters with my name at the top. When they want to kill me, they will do it. In March of this year, Cáceres was shot dead inside her own home. I guess it isn't surprising, is it, that Henry Kissinger and Hillary Clinton are such good friends. Black Lives Matter. That now iconic phrase is more than 3 years old, having gone from Facebook post to Twitter hashtag to national and international political movement, fueled, of course, by the repeated and tragic killing of unarmed black people in the United States by the police. But what has it achieved so far in practical terms? More than 30 unarmed black people have been killed by police this year alone. So are black lives any safer as a result of Black Lives Matter protests? And is the movement impacting the US presidential election? To debate this, I'm joined by Barbara Reynolds, columnist, author, ordained minister, and a former civil rights activist in the 1960s. She's a critic of Black Lives Matter. And from New York, Shaun King, journalist, activist, senior justice writer at the New York Daily News, and one of the most prominent faces of Black Lives Matter. Thanks both for joining me in the arena. Barbara Reynolds, just to kick off with you, you've referred to Black Lives Matter as a motley group engaged in confrontational and divisive tactics and ignoring what our history has taught. What do you mean by that?
Okay, let me just jump right in. First of all, I was a protester myself when I was their age in 1965. I was in the civil rights movement protesting the right for blacks to vote. So this is why we're here today, because of Dr. King's nonviolent movement. Now, here's my basic problem with Black Lives Matter. When I saw a protest of Black Lives Matter groups, and they were chanting, "Pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon." That's the first thing. It just sent chills down my spine.
Referring to the police, you mean?
Referring to the police. And then when Baltimore burned, and we had businesses being burned, drugstores being raided, and those drugs turned up in black communities, I saw this as non-productive.
Okay, let me go to Shaun King in New York. Is Black Lives Matter guilty of going against the legacy of the civil rights movement, as Barbara is claiming?
No, I don't think so. And first off, I have a great deal of respect for Barbara, for all my elders. And I think that what Barbara has seen is a very tiny, negative microcosm of something that may have happened over the past few years. She's picked one or two negative moments, which are far and away the exception and not the standard of this movement. There are not only chapters of Black Lives Matter in cities all over the United States and around the world, but there are local grassroots organizations in every major city in this country doing peaceful, wonderful, powerful work, advocacy work, be it with fighting police brutality or local education or racial violence or economic disparities. I think there's a lot of good stuff that Barbara may not be aware of that's going on every single day, not with dozens or hundreds, but tens of thousands of people, young people like myself, who are committed to making this country better in peaceful ways. And so you could go back to any point in human history.
Sure, let me ask you this, just for the purpose of our global audience, just clarify two things. Number one, Black Lives Matter is a non-violent movement.
And is that
Sure.
that is the case? Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't.
Absolutely.
Now that's what you
Okay,
say.
I'm asking him.
Well,
I'm not saying anything. I'm
that's
asking
what-
Shaun.
that's what
I'll
you-
come back to you in a moment, Barbara. One second. And let me just
Okay.
clarify one thing with Shaun. What would you describe as Black Lives Matter's biggest success so far?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because I think our biggest success, and this is important to say, is making the entire world aware. We've spent most of the past 2 years making the world fully and completely aware of police brutality and racial violence and the reality that racism is still very, very present in America. It's, as you know, it's so hard to break through in today's news cycle, be it with Donald Trump or this issue of terrorism around the world. So to be able to break through and have the world talking about police brutality. Last year, 1,207 people were killed by police in America. That's the highest number ever recorded in the history of this country. And the world knows this.
Barbara, when Black Lives Matter activists say someone like yourself or veteran civil rights activists like Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, who you say haven't been given the respect or attention they deserve by the Black Lives Matter generation, younger generation, they say, well, they're out of touch. Many of them say they're out of touch. Maybe they've got a point. Maybe they are out of touch. Maybe the methods that you used in the 60s were right for the 60s. But today, we need a different form of struggle, a different form of resistance.
Well, I think that each generation has to form their own methods and strategies. But what I would like to see is for the youth, the younger people, to reach out to us because we've had experience, we've been down this road before. But we do have a disconnect. Because what Shaun is talking about, some of it, I admit I don't know about it.
But Shaun, is there a reason people, not just Barbara, but wider media, community leaders, politicians, is there a reason they don't know about some of the stuff you're doing, or there's this disconnect, or there's quote-unquote misinformation? Is that because Black Lives Matter is perhaps too decentralized, too anarchic even? Where are the leaders? There are no obvious leaders as there were for the groups in the 1960s. Is that fair?
I think I understand that, but it's not that there's a lack of leaders. Like, we don't think it's leaderless. We think it's leaderful. I mean, there are hundreds of leaders all across the country.
Who speaks for it? Who speaks for the movement?
Well, hundreds of us. And I think that's what's powerful. And not even hundreds, but I would say thousands of us all represent our own concerns in our own cities. And I think we learned from previous movements the pain of having just one person. If just one person represented this movement, and they were caught in scandal or were assassinated, the whole movement would crumble. And so I think we learned the painful lesson from the 60s and 70s that it's actually a powerful thing for us to be decentralized.
Well, that's a good lesson to learn because actually Dr. King was not the leader. The media kept saying he was a leader, but he led through a coalition. But the point is that I've heard several of the leaders say, this is not your grandmother's movement. There's this, I've heard that. And I hear some of the things would turn me off because I'm grandmother, but I'm also the mother of the District of Columbia. When you're cursing and using hate language, some of us, we can't connect through that.
Shaun, do you think Black Lives Matter is too anti-police perceptionally? And that's going to harm you in the long run?
No, I don't think so. And that's a challenge, though, that we have to face. We have to be able to identify issues of police brutality without people saying we're anti-police. I'm not anti-police. This movement is not anti-police. We're certainly not a violent movement. There has been literally almost no violence emanating from this movement or protesters, no more than you would see in any other movement.
When the Black Lives Matter people and they were chanting pigs in a blanket.
That may have happened one time. There have been literally thousands and thousands of protests. We don't even know if the people who said that, if they were actually even really a part of this movement. That's not a common phrase that you hear in protests.
Okay, if it's not common, why not say it's just wrong?
It is wrong. It is wrong. I would never say it.
Let me just ask you about some of the backlash we've seen from many politicians on both sides of the divide, Democrat and Republican, who've talked about this Black Lives Matter slogan and saying, well, what's wrong with saying all lives matter? And a lot of people get very offended when they hear all lives matter. Explain to our audience why someone like you chooses to say Black Lives Matter rather than all lives matter for people who don't get it.
Yeah. In theory, all lives do matter. I think if you pushed any activist and asked them that, they would tell you. but the very present reality in America is that all people are not treated equally under the law. Young African Americans are exponentially more likely to be killed by police than young white Americans. That's just a reality. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we say it because the reality for most of us in America is that America doesn't treat black folk equally, even if it's just equal pay for equal work. If you look at any statistic, it'll show you black women doing, that are qualified for one job paired up against white men doing the exact same job with the exact same qualifications get significantly less pay. And so, of course, the principle of all lives mattering, that's real. I believe that in principle, but the reality is that America doesn't function based on that principle.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me here in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.